All right, rejoining us for the first time in a while is channel favorite Mike Pako Benitez, our favorite Strike Eagle weapons system officer, and the man behind the newsletter of record, The Merge. It's actually the only newsletter that matters in the military, T&E, and procurement space. I read it voraciously when it comes out, and you should subscribe for sure. And I'll put the subscription link in the episode description below. So Pako, welcome back. It's great to see you.
It's great to be back, although I am the #2 fan favorite on your channel. I did not get the mooch at the end of the year. I'm disappointed. 2024, this is my year. I think it's going to be my year.
Okay. You barely missed, as I said, at the Moochie's ceremony on New Year's Eve. You barely missed by tens of thousands of views, and that's not a whole lot over the course of a year on the channel. So I'm liking your chances. Your bandwidth is always the long pole in the tent because you're a busy man out there doing your thing.
It's always my fault.
It is my fault. Pako, it's your fault. Last week, or was it the week before, at the Air Force Association annual convention, normally they have it here in the DC area, but it was out in the Denver area this year. I don't know if they vary that every year or not, but I didn't get to go because it was not here in the local area. But the Secretary of the Air Force, Kendall, made a major announcement, not entirely a surprise announcement, but a major rollout of a reorganization of both the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Space Force. Let me read the preamble to this reorganization. Secretary Kendall writes, "It has become clear to the entire senior leadership team that we are not optimized for great power competition. Over more than 2 decades, we have optimized to support post-9/11 conflicts and demands. This is not what the nation needs for the coming decades of strategic competition. Accordingly, we will conduct a major initiative over the next several months to identify and implement the changes needed to meet our pacing challenge. This initiative will involve a comprehensive look at all aspects of how we organize, train, and equip the Air Force and Space Force." So what is going on here, Pako?
First of all, it's a ton to unpack. That announcement actually had 24 key decisions, and each one of those decisions was monumental things. By orders of magnitude, this is the biggest reorganization of the United States Air Force in its history. It's also going to take multiple years, not multiple months, no matter how fast they want to move. Just the amount of change. You could kind of put them into 4 buckets. So the first bucket is develop people. The second one's generate readiness. The third one is project power. And the fourth one is develop capability. So those are the 4 kind of lines of effort, if you will, the buckets of those 24 key decisions and like why it matters for great power competition. And that's the GCP is what you'll hear a lot of the Air Force senior leaders kind of say as an acronym. We're doing GCP. We're optimizing for GCP. That is what this is.
And that's code for primarily the China threat?
Exactly. So if you go back, so the Air Force, you said it when you started, the Air Force, like all the services, they don't fight wars. They organize, train, and equip forces to give to the combatant commanders to fight wars. So when you look at that, there's everything from buying stuff to training and being ready to, when called upon, do your thing. And when you look at the history of the Air Force, go back to the global war on terror, the Air Force optimized for that, and it went to these things called AEFs. It had these weird deployment cycles, and it was kind of a piecemeal people. You'd show up at base X that's already established in the Middle East, and you would rotate forces in and out. And if you go back into like the Cold War, we had an organization where you had TAC, SAC, and MAC were the 3 major commands that kind of ran everything. And when the Cold War ended, they reorganized the Air Force to get away from that. And so this is just another logical evolution of the Air Force to meet the demands that it's been asked to perform.
So because if I'm watching this, I'm like, so what's going to be different? So here are the current Air Force major commands. Like you said, the last time I understood this, it was TAC, MAC, and SAC, right?
Yeah.
So now we're organized into these major commands: ACC, Air Education and Training; Air Force Global Strike; Air Force Materiel, Air Force Reserve, Air Force Special Operations, AFSOC, Air Mobility, Pacific Air Forces, and Air Forces in Europe, and Air Forces Africa. All right, so those are the commands. So as we go along here, I'll ask you, is that going to change? What we just read, are those commands going to change? But
Yes.
you mentioned the major prongs.
Mm-hmm.
So let's unpack some of the sub-elements therein. So you talked about develop people. Let me read some of the bullets there. Consolidate force development functions under an Airman Development Command. Expand technical tracks for officers while creating technical tracks for enlisted, while reintroducing warrant officers in IT and cyber fields. Focus training on mixed skill sets to develop mission-ready airmen. That sounds like a big bumper sticker. Transform leadership development and training to prepare officers to lead airmen and guardians. Reminder, though, that's the term for members of the Space Force. In the context of great power competition. Redesign career paths for guardians that meet high-tech operational demands. So are we not doing those things now?
A lot of that is rebranding, to be honest with you. To your chart that you had up before, Air Education and Training Command is being renamed to the Airman Development Command. It's a little bit of a philosophy shift. So training and AETC was kind of the ways, if you will, and now it's kind of focused on the end state is where we want to develop airmen. So I think it's a little bit of a rebranding, but also probably a much needed rebranding, to be honest with you. It has a couple of nested initiatives. The warrant officer program probably being the most, the one that probably gets a lot of attention. The Air Force is the only branch that doesn't have warrant officers, and it's going to be implemented on a limited basis. And so we'll see where that goes. And I'll be really interested to see how that goes with the proliferation of unmanned aircraft and the embrace of the warrant officer rank in the Air Force. If there's a connection to be had, maybe a few years down the road.
Is this changing career tracks in general? So let's say, for instance, will they have a in the cockpit only career path? Because the Air Force has procurement only career paths, right? And I'm sure they'll continue those kinds of things. But will they have other emergent career tracks that don't exist now?
I think this rebranding gives them the opportunity to start that conversation before under the old organization and the mental model that existed for generations was every officer that came into the Air Force was being groomed to be the chief of staff, and so they had a cookie cutter thing. You would roll the dice, play the game, and see where you go, and then depending on the cards you get dealt with, and you get set up for success. And there's ways to do that. You can kind of chart your career path, but it give you very little options if you did not want to be the chief of staff of the Air Force. So if you wanted to just be, I want to be a lieutenant colonel or colonel and have an impact at that level because that's my passion is the people at that level. There's really no option. It was either up or out. And you probably remember that from the Navy. And it's taken a long time to beat that out of the culture of the Air Force. And I think that this opportunity, by focusing on great power competition and focusing on readiness, because readiness is what matters, putting people to play to their strengths and their passions to serve in the capacity that best suits them and meets the needs of the Air Force, that's a win-win. And it's something that's honestly just been this bureaucratic uphill battle for a generation. I've seen a lot of amazing leaders, amazing fighter pilots just leave because there's no home for them to do the things that they're most passionate about. So I think this is an opportunity to fix that.
In addition to improving readiness and fighting great power competition, this also has, as you've just sort of hinted at, a retention recruiting element to it, right? That's the other demand signal that they're trying to meet with this reorganization, right?
Yeah, you're trying to appeal to a new generation of people to serve, and you give them different ways that they can contribute to society and in uniform. And again, I think it's part of the process of appealing to the right people, developing them deliberately to do the things that align with their strengths, give them the tools to be successful in and out of uniform when they leave. And this is probably the most fungible thing in this reorg that they've announced, but I think it actually has like the biggest upside but it's all about people.
The next prong, as you mentioned, was generate readiness.
This one's interesting. Remember when we talked about TAC and MAC? It used to be up until 91. It was Tactical Air Command, Strategic Air Command, and Mobility Airlift Command, MAC. Those all went away. They became AMC, ACC, and then SAC went away. It merged. Then it came back later with Global Strike. The big thing to take away from here is we have on your chart, you have Air Combat Command, Global Strike Command, and Air Mobility Command. So you have those three major commands. Over time, the way that the Pentagon and the Air Force has worked is a lot of the things that used to happen to be centralized planning at the Pentagon those authorities had been divvied out to those 4-stars in charge of those commands. And so over time, if you're an Air Combat Command, you not only have to worry about providing ready combat forces, you also are writing requirements for weapon systems, and you're worried about helping build the Pentagon budget to put money in different line items to help programming to buy those things, and you're doing testing of the equipment. So it's just a wide variety of things. And so over time, each one of these things became islands of excellence. So Air Combat Command has all the fighters, Global Strike has all the bombers, Air Mobility has all the airlift and tankers, and they're doing things, not talking to each other, and there's not really a way to integrate at the basically decisions and acquiring things to make sure that they all work together. It becomes either haphazard or after the fact. So part of this generate readiness is let's take the acquisition and requirements away from these major commands and let them focus on what we want them to do, which is to generate combat power. This is the focus on readiness. There was a discussion about bringing back large scale exercises and inspections and really dialing in a force generation model to fix the Air Force. That's probably the number one thing that's been destroying readiness in the Air Force, is the lack of a way to calculate and categorize deployments. It's not like the Navy, where you have a carrier air wing that's assigned based on carrier rotations, and you can plan out 3, 4, 5 years. And if you change one piece of that puzzle or extend 1 month here on a deployment, you can actually figure out the second, third order effects. The Air Force really doesn't have a model because they don't have a deployment model. They deploy as piecemeal things. And so it's really hard to articulate cost benefit when you're making decisions. And so what's happened is the Air Force has been kind of picked deploy, because there's not really a way to validate the cost benefit. And so the force generation model is a way to bring stability to the forces, stabilize readiness, and really provide a better quality of life, which goes back to retention.
It surprises me, except I think we've talked about this before, is this sort of, as you described, the sort of piecemeal way that, a fighter squadron will deploy and the logistics guys have been there for a while and they're not integrated and they don't know each other. And it's just sort of ad hoc and plug and play with each sub-element of the overall picture, which is absolutely not how the Navy does a carrier strike group, for instance, or an amphibious ready group. One of the specific sub-elements within this generate readiness series of bullets that grabs my eye. Well, you mentioned implement large-scale exercises and mission-focused training. Yeah, that nobody should have an argument or any quarrel with that. That sounds like right on. But then they talk about design and execute, and this is the part that my spidey sense starts to tingle. Design and execute no notice, limited notice, readiness assessments, and inspections to reflect pacing challenges. In execution, this sounds like a major red ass.
Yes and no. I think that there has to be a way to assess readiness, like truly assess readiness, without hey, in 2 years you're going to have an inspection. And I've lived through that on active duty. I know in 2 years there's an inspection, and so there's this road to becoming inspection ready. And that there's a really good saying in the military: any unit that's passed inspection is not combat ready, and any combat ready unit never passed an inspection. So there's definitely a balance. It'll be really curious to see how they pull that off. And especially for flying wings, you can't come in and no notice something, because you actually have to plan airspace and plan like scenarios. And there's like if you have a tanker, like there's, a month or two of planning to make sure you can line up the tanker unit and the times and everything and schedules. And it's not as easy as it sounds where you can just show up. And it used to be, so SAC, Strategic Air Command, used to do this back in the day. During the Cold Wars, they would do these no-notice nuclear inspections. This is back when bombers used to fly 24 hours a day airborne with live nuclear weapons, by the way. Different time. But there's definitely a play for it. Back in, they used to do these inspections. They're called ORIs, operational readiness inspections, and they went away in 2013 for a bunch of reasons. Budget cuts, focus on we're kind of just post surge in Afghanistan, Iraq's drawn down, and honestly, the forces were just getting too small, and it just became a distraction. So you'd in between your Middle East deployments, you would have to be ready to fight a Cold War scenario, and everyone's like, this doesn't make any sense. It's just a distraction. So everyone's kind of going through the motions anyways, and then they finally said, you know what, this is we're not measuring the things that matter. Let's just stop this. So they pivoted to a thing called UCIs, unit compliance inspections, and there was kind of a self-reporting mechanism, and there were some checks and balances from higher headquarters, but that kind of persisted for about 10 years. So I think it's time, as you go back to major theater war, optimizing for GCP, great power competition, and being able to be responsive, having your, where all the things, where's the pack up list, and how long does it take to pack things up? How many pallets does it take to deploy this unit? Like, those are the things that should be like table stakes day one as a combat deployable unit, but they aren't. And that's a huge problem. And it goes back to a little bit of how the Air Force was organized and how it was providing forces. It didn't have to pick up like a wing. And it sounds maybe a little bit confusing, which I think gets into the next thing we'll talk about. But a wing doesn't just get up and deploy. That's not how the Air Force is structured right now. It used to have composite wings where a wing commander had a couple bombers, had a fighter squadron, had a suppression of enemy air defense squadron, had tankers, all under the authority of a single wing commander. So the wing could deploy, and it could actually do integrated combat operations. The way the Air Force is set up now, no wing commander has any of those assets. You have a wing that just has a type of fighter. You have another wing that just has tankers. You have another wing that just has airlift. Part of the reorganization, I think it's going to go back to like where do these wings need to come together and be able to integrate to deploy as a force package. That presentation goes back to the force generation model, and how you present forces to those combatant commanders is a huge part of this initiative. And those are the details that haven't been quite worked out yet.
So were these squadrons disaggregated during the post 9/11 wars because you were answering a demand signal from a joint command that just needed close air support in some area, or tankers at Sheikh Issa and not everything else? Is that what happened?
Money, yes. You can,
money.
if you chart the Air Force back to 75 years or so, every time the Air Force has reorganized, it's doing one of two things. It's either optimizing for combat effectiveness, or it's optimizing for budget efficiency. But it can't be both. And so when you consolidate that, you lose some efficiencies for like parts management and things like that, but you have combat effectiveness. And so this was another optimization initiative when we got away from deploying forces for kind of firefighting, if you will, around the world, the 911 force, and we started being the rotational presence in the Middle East, which lasted 15, 20 years. That's really what made everything kind of switch. The same thing with like in the Air Force, your maintenance and operations, they used to be in one unit under a commander, and then they separated, then they came back together, then they separated, and they came back together, and we're on the fifth iteration of that in the Air Force's history. And every time that happens, you can draw a direct line to budget versus combat effectiveness.
The last thought on this particular sub-element, the generate readiness sub-element, with respect to inspections. Your point is well taken in that inspections does not have to be a dirty word, depending on how they're executed, right? I mean, the cynic will say, look, let us just do our job and we'll be ready. That thereby we're ready. We'll just execute a flight schedule and go where we need to be on time. But that assumes that the unit commander or the wing commander knows what's going to happen in the future. As we know, that very chaotic environment. in the case of the Navy, I'm thinking of what the Ike Strike Group is doing right now. They had no idea this is what they'd be doing during the turnaround, you know? So you have to be ready across the board, even with things that you don't think are high priority, you know? So there's a not too subtle difference between a deep dive across all the mission areas and harassment. And as you say, the command responsible for the inspections has to be cognizant of that and be able to iterate where they're like you said, the things we're doing are useless. Let's stop it and let's, modify this into something that's more productive and more in line with what's going to generate mission readiness. So let's assume that this wants to do that instead of just the harassment piece, because in a environment where retention is already an issue, that wouldn't help at all. That you're totally getting harassed every time you're back in garrison. There's no time to get your act together or whatever, because you're always fearing, particularly COs are fearing that they're going to get fired for failing an inspection. So that's no bueno either.
Inspections is definitely a morale killer, because it's the preparation and it's the stress of it. And I would love to see them lean into it and do something that, what boosts morale? Competition, where you can have other units come together instead of being graded by someone from a headquarters, unit. We're doing a competition between Squadron A and Squadron B on mission, 3. And here's the grading criteria, and it becomes a competition. Iron sharpens iron. I think it's a huge opportunity if done right. But yeah, inspections could be good, they could be bad. So we'll see what the execution looks like.
No, iron sharpens iron. I like that. That's a cool idea. All right, the next prong is project power. What are some of the sub-elements there?
The big one for this is units of action, also known as wings. There's been 2 or 3 different initiatives over the past 10 years for the Air Force to try to figure out how it presents forces. One of them was measure squadrons, just like the Navy tries to measure ships. The Air Force tried to measure squadrons. Turns out that's not a good metric. It started trying to measure wings. That's not a good metric. So now they have units of action. And so the problem they're trying to solve here is, if I'm the wing commander at whatever Air Force base and my wing has to deploy, who deploys? Well, the wing commander is also the base commander in the Air Force. So he's also the town mayor. So he doesn't actually deploy. This is part of the problem with the Air Force. So another wing commander has to leave his wing or get plucked out of another job and deploy to be the deployed wing commander with a deployed staff. And then all of the other, the home base wing deploys, but the wing and its organization stays there. So you have this, you don't have a unity of command. You don't have unity of effort. You kind of break apart a wing to try to put it back together later. And so this concept is, you have deployable combat wings, in-place combat wings, and you have combat generation wings. And then you have a base commander and wing commander kind of separation of, which is kind of how the Army does. They have a base commander, wing commander, Marine Corps a little bit too. And the Navy, I think the Navy does that too. The Air Force is the one that, there's like 1 or 2 exceptions, but 99% of the organization, the base commander is the wing commander. And if you have a deployable combat wing at your base, it's just a weird conundrum. It doesn't really make any sense anymore.
No, that I did not realize that. In the Navy, the wing commander is absolutely not the base commander, and I don't know how that would ever work. So this sounds like a good fix. And then the final prong within this is called develop capabilities, and this is along the lines of what you were saying, that you're divesting combat commands from things associated with particularly test and evaluation and acquisition.
So back to your list, there's a new command that's being stood up called the Integrated Capabilities Command, the ICC. That's going to be led by a 3-star. And because you're consolidating all of those acquisition programs and requirements under a single authority, you're going to get cross-platform integration. So those stovepipes of excellence or islands of excellence, you're going to put them all together. And when you look at the way that everyone's looking at fighting with multi-domain and joint and integrated, that's the only way to really approach true organized training and equip. So this is probably going to be a little bit of a pain, because consolidating those authorities back from where they are right now into this single command is going to take years because people aren't just going to move to wherever this place is going to be. So there's going to be a lot of remote work and cross-functional organizations for a few years until this kind of pans out. But once it works, when we get there, if it gets there, it's going to be good. It's going to be a good thing. And then the two other things that go with this fourth pillar is there's two new offices being stood up under the Secretary of the Air Force. One of them is the Office of Competitive Activities. This is going to be the office that coordinates all of the classified stuff across the Department of the Air Force. Amazingly, it doesn't exist right now. So the amount of, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of security stovepipes that don't talk to each other just in the Air Force. So having an office that is focused not on the administrative oversight of those activities, but coordinating that as far as combat capability development goes. So that is what that office is supposed to do, which is that's well overdue. The other one is called the Program Assessment and Evaluation Office. The Office of the Secretary of Defense has an office very similar to this. Frank Kendall, the Secretary of the Air Force, used to work in OSD, and so he's familiar with that office. So this sounds like he's copy-pasting that model into the Air Force. And the reason that is important is it sounds crazy when you think about it. Up until now, the Secretary of the Air Force does not have someone in charge of a common strategy and analytics to do resourcing decisions. So if they say I have $20 of bills to pay and I have $18, so I'm $2 short, what is going to be the minimal impact? Or if Congress gives me an extra $5, where can I put those $5 to maximize our operational effectiveness, combat capability? There's not an office in the Air Force that could do that and make that decision. It's all subjective, personality based, experience based, and personality based. So having an objective analytics to drive those decisions that are defensible when you go back to Congress is really, really important. And again, it really hasn't existed at the level that really needed to. So this is for me, I'm pretty excited to see how this works, because as the Air Force looks to modernize its force structure and divest things, it'll have the data and the analytics to be 100% objective about what it tries to do, and hopefully not get drugged down into politics like it has before on the Hill.
Office of Competitive Activities. It sounds very Soviet.
It does. I thought the same thing.
Kind of this cryptic, Dr. Evil thing. When you hinted at the devil in the details about people moving and work from home, and this is where it's going to get hard in terms of how do we stand up and then man these emerging activities when we consolidate disparate decision nodes. It will require that people relocate potentially. And then when you say people relocating, then the power centers could shift, and that starts to sound like potentially I'm going to say it, BRAC situation. And so that's when Congress starts to get involved. So within all of this, has Secretary Kendall or anybody else, to your knowledge, expressed concerns or assuaged the fears of lawmakers associated with losing, facilities within their districts and that sort of thing?
No, and I think it's too early to go there. There are some things that Congress definitely needs. So there eventually will need money to do the administrative part of the reorganization. I think there's no money in this year's budget or next year's, but 2026, I think they're looking to add some money. The 3-star appointments are congressional appointments. So there's going to be a conversation about changing some of the Title 10 U.S. code for that. BRAC does have a recurring requirement from Congress to ask themselves that question. It always gets deferred, but it's there. I don't think BRAC is going to be a thing. Not for this. BRAC is a thing that keeps getting pushed down the road, but it's not because of this. So I don't think that's going to be an issue.
Well, that's good news. The other thing that's happening in parallel here, because we've talked pretty much specifically U.S. Air Force, is this same initiative is affecting the Space Force. So they just had a change of command where General Saltzman took over. That's him on the right there. This is an actual picture. This is a real uniform he's wearing. I'm loving the sleeve length there. And here he is closer up. This is probably his speech when he assumed command. They wear that tunic. And it's got the cool medallions all around the top of the cover there. I'll be honest, I kind of forget about the Space Force. It seemed like sort of a whimsical lark associated with the previous presidential administration. Is this proving to have some real utility? Because what General Salzman is saying, that this reorg is especially germane to his needs, because he's basically saying, I don't have anything that I need to get the job done. So what's your sense of how the Space Force is evolving its utility and how it's playing nice or otherwise with the Air Force?
It was time, when you look back, the Space Force needed to be stood up. Now what it needs to do is be organized to do what's being asked of it. It is not organized, trained, or equipped whatsoever. So breaking it apart and being a separate service permitted it that space to grow, to be able to organize, train, and equip. I don't think it would, if it was still under the Air Force, of the chief of the staff of the Air Force, when this kind of organization, I think it was just, it's a foregone conclusion. It needed to be its own thing. But one of the things that they actually, because they were new and they're actually really small. There's not that many people. There's under, I think, 10,000 Guardians in the Air Force, in the Space Force right now. Probably closer to 8,000.
8,000 personnel in the entire Space Force?
Yeah, like the New York Police Department has more people than the Space Force. It's not very big. It's not very big. But it has a lot of technology and a big budget for a lot of classified stuff in space, and they're moving to a commercial model. But one of the things that's really interesting is it gave them that freedom to kind of don't do what the Air Force was doing, do whatever you want. So they spent a lot of time with a clean sheet of paper, and I think they came up with some pretty good ideas. One of them, which is probably the biggest thing that I think is going to come out of it for a long time, is they did an experiment where instead of wings, they have these thing called deltas, and they have an experimentation delta where they have the acquisitions folks and the operators in a combined delta, and that has been an overwhelming success. It sounds completely obvious. Anyone who works out in the commercial sector, imagine if Apple was going to design a phone and never talk to a single customer, and then put it on the shelf and hope people bought it. Like, that's terrible. That's a terrible business model, right? But that's kind of how the Air Force has been set up that way. The Navy's actually a little bit better. The Army moved to Army Features Command a few years ago. The Air Force actually tried to do the same thing and it failed internally, and so it never saw the light of day. But this doing it at the wing level allows them to have grassroots feedback to inform things on a decision cycle that you just weren't going to see when these are segregated into different 4-star commands. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest upsides from the Space Force. I'm really, really excited to see that making progress and getting it some of the attention it deserves.
So overall, are you liking what you're seeing with this reorganization? Does it strike you as necessary and actionable?
Ooh, plans. I love the plan. Execution is going to be very, very challenging. And the reason is, and it's not saying it's not going to happen, but none of these people that are implementing this plan or announcing this plan will be around to see it through. No one, not a single person. So you're going to have organizational buy-in like day one, early on. And I understand it spent a lot of time making sure that they had buy-in by collecting feedback and soliciting inputs. This was it got leaked a few months ago on accident, but by and large, this one's been pretty closely held to the vest for something that's such a huge organizational change that impacts literally every person in the Air Force. And so they did a good job of keeping it close and bringing people in for feedback and making sure that all the different opinions were heard. And so decisions aren't made in a bubble. And so getting that buy-in, I think, is huge, because it has to persist beyond just the thumbprint of the people who came up with the plan. It's the implementation and the follow through. That's what's important. And hopefully Congress is along for the journey, and their voices are also heard, but they don't become a blocker for instituting the change that the Air Force needs.
Well, Pako, it's great to have you back on the channel. We look forward to having you back again soon. Again, Pako is the man behind the Merge newsletter. It is awesome. I read it religiously when it gets pushed to my inbox. Everything you need to know about the defense space acquisition operations in a very consumable format. The link to subscribe is in the episode description below. So thanks again, Pako.
Thanks, Mooch. Till next time.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything. And I look forward to talking to you again very soon.